So in our previous module, we talked about some of the terminology that was used in defining what is a web page and a website and some of those types of things. We'd like to go a little bit further and talk about how do we make a web page display for an end user. Well, that's kind of important to understand what's going on. And there's two separate pieces of software that are being used when you go to visit a web page on the internet. The first one that we want to talk about is the web browser. The web browser is installed on the client machine. Now, the client machine could be your laptop, it could be a cell phone or a tablet, and it doesn't have to be your specific machine. Of course, this could be from a user anywhere in the world. I manage websites for various different clients and in some cases my own family, and I can look into the logs and see that people are coming to visit my websites from China, from France and Italy, Great Britain, and other places. They don't have to be in the country that you're in, and you shouldn't necessarily expect that. We see a lot of different people coming from all over the world, and that's part of the idea of the internet, allowing people from all over the world to share information. The browser is installed on those end user machines wherever they are, and it allows the person to view the page. Well, how does it do it? Well, at its base content, a web browser is going to do a couple of functions. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to allow a user to select a file, either by typing in an address or following a link. When it does that, it's going to download a file. Now, this is a text/HTML MIME type file. What does that mean? Well, it just means it's encoded in a certain way. It's plain text and it's easy for it to parse. Parsing is the process of reading through a file and figuring out the different sections. When your browser does this, it creates something called the DOM, or Document Object Model. The DOM is used to let the end user see on the screen what are its different components. Why does the header go at the top and not in the middle of the page? This is all controlled by the DOM. Some parts are hidden from the user, but very important because they tell the browser how to display things. Others are made very visible. And as the browser is going through and reading the file, it's looking for, hey, here's an extra file I need to download. Maybe it's a CSS file like we mentioned earlier, or maybe it's an image file or a video file. Maybe this is on the same server that you're on. Maybe it's on a different server someplace else. We'll talk about servers in just a minute. So each time it's going to look to read these files and figure out how to display it and how to show it to the user. Now, over the years of the internet, going way back to 1993 when the original source code for our first browser was released, browsers have constantly been updating. We talked about in our previous module the browser wars that we had in late 90s, early 2000s. Internet Explorer won that war, and as much grief as that browser is given, I remember when it was the most standard compliant browser out there. Officially, Internet Explorer has now gone away. It has been replaced by Microsoft by their new browser called Edge. And there are other browsers. Netscape, which lost the war, has gone away. It morphed and transformed and is now Firefox. There's also Chrome and Opera and several other browsers out there. Chrome, or one of its derivatives, is by far the most common browser out there. However, all browsers do the same basic thing. There is still a bit of a browser war going on now. Now, instead of creating new tags for people to use and things like that, they're trying to focus on what's the most important tags and getting the tags to display correctly. Some tags created by the W3 Standards Committee are a little bit more challenging to display. And so trying to get them as accurate as possible is a big deal. But the other part is there is a war based upon JavaScript. The Microsoft Edge browser was actually a faster browser if you didn't consider the JavaScript render engine. Google, which was the one who originated Chrome, they cared a lot about JavaScript because a lot of the pages that they create for things like their Gmail and the Google Office docs, those required a lot of JavaScript processing, and so they were very focused on their JavaScript engine. That made dynamic web pages that were client facing much faster for them. So there's a lot of give and takes in trying to determine which is the best browser. We want to focus on our modules about being standards compliant. What's going to work in all the browsers? Now, you should test in different browsers, whether it's a mobile browser on your phone or if it's a desktop browser on your laptop or desktop machine. They will all render things slightly different based upon the size of the screen, the capabilities of the processor that's part of that machine, and other components. And so browsers are still very important, and they play an extremely important role in allowing your web page to be seen by the end user. Now, I mentioned that there was two separate softwares that were very important to displaying your web page. We talked about the browser, but there's also a web server. Now, what makes web servers a little bit confusing is there are two different things with the name of web server. So we have web server hardware, and this is a machine often, not always, but often dedicated to serving web pages. Now, this machine might be hosted in some major data center. It might be in a rack amongst 1,000 other machines. A lot of the servers that I host and maintain are done this way. I go to a hosting company. If you go to a hosting company and you're paying $7 or $8 a month, you have a machine that's in one of these racks amongst hundreds, if not thousands, of other machines. In fact, you might have multiple websites on that single server. So a web server can be a piece of hardware. If it's a dedicated machine, and especially if it's in a rack installed with lots of other machines, you will see that it's a little bit different than your standard desktop or laptop. There's probably no keyboard or mouse associated with it, but it's going to have a relatively fast processor, lots of storage space or access to storage space, and it's going to have a fast network card. This will allow it to send data out through its internal network and out to the internet as fast as possible. Now, in a server farm, you're going to often find that there are other pieces of hardware that work with the web server. These could be things like network routers, which help to move data back and forth quickly. Switches, which have a similar but slightly different function. Firewalls, which protect servers from outside attacks. And many other types of tools. We're not going to look at or worry about that. We're just going to focus on the server. And on this web server hardware, you're going to find the other web server, which is web server software. Now, what software is installed? Well, there are various different types of web servers that you could find. Now, on a Windows server, you might find something like Internet Information Server, or IIS. IIS works very well if you're working within the Windows family of applications. So if you have an application that runs on a Windows machine and you have your web server on a Windows machine and you're using a Microsoft-based database, you're going to find that all those different components work very well. If you're serving up standard HTML web pages and you don't have a dynamic web application, IIS will still work. However, it tends to provide a little bit more overhead, which means it's going to be a little bit slower compared to some other servers. Now, you can find other web server software on Windows, or more commonly, you find it on a Unix or Unix derivative type of server. These are referred to often as Linux, but there are others like BSD, IRIX, etc. So these software on Unix machines typically is either something like Nginx or Apache, which is the more common one. The Apache web server is probably the most common server software out there, partially because it comes with most versions of Unix and it is free with those versions of Unix. So therefore, it has a lot of popularity. It's also considered to be pretty lightweight, which means that you can run additional websites without having to have as big or as fast a computer, or you can run even more websites for the same size computer that you might find on a Windows server. Now, what does this web server software do? Well, it's going to take the request that the browser makes. It says, hey, I need a file. And it's going to say, well, is this file here? Oh, it is. Let me send that to you. Now, that file could be an image, it could be an HTML document, it could be something else. Regardless of what it is, its job is to take in request and then to send back information. Now, what happens if that file doesn't exist? Well, it's still going to send something back. And if you've ever gotten a 404 error page, you might see it come up as a file not found. And that's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to get an error code. In fact, there's a lot of different error codes that you might get that the web server is going to display for you. Things like you don't have permission to view this because maybe you're not logged in. Maybe it's going to be the file has moved, and let me tell you about it so you know where to go to. Maybe it's going to be an error like, oh, there was an error on the server, something happened, and we can't show you this file. Each of these different types of errors have what's known as an error code that goes back and is sent back to the web browser for it to display. Now, depending upon what type of file you requested and where that error code came in, will often depend upon how your web page is going to be displayed in the browser. So if you have a web page that you've requested and it shows, but on the web page it said, hey, I'm looking for this image, and the image didn't show, well, you're still going to see the web page, but maybe there's a little broken image symbol that you're going to see where that image was supposed to be. So your web server software is very important for sending that information out to the end user. Now you might ask, well, how does it know how to send that information? Well, there's something called the HTTP, which is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. If you've ever looked inside of a web address, the very first part starts with HTTP or HTTPS. The S just means it's encrypted or secure. So that's how it's going to send the data. When we send data across the network, we need to make sure we understand how that request is being sent and how responses are received. HTTP is that protocol that lets the browser talk to the server. When that connection is made, those two can speak, then we can start displaying the web page for the end user. Now, how many of you have gone to a web page and you just go to CNN.com? You didn't specify a file, but one still showed up. Or maybe you went to Instagram or Facebook or Amazon and you said the same thing. You didn't request a file. There's no file listed there, but one displayed. Well, if you go to the root address, whether it's root for the whole website or even for a folder, if you don't specify a file, one of two things is going to happen. So the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to look inside of the associated default file list. And a default file list is just on the server. It says, hey, if I see a folder name and I don't see a file, I'm going to look for files that are called, and it's going to look in a list. And it's going to say, oh, is this file exist? If it exists, I'm going to send you that file so you can display it. By default, most servers start with index.htm. Then they look at maybe index.html. Then maybe home.htm and home.html and default.htm and default.html, and they might go through a variety of different ones. Now, the webmaster for that website can go in and change that list. They can add certain files, they can remove files, they can change the order that it's displayed. So maybe you want to show index.html instead of index.htm. You could go in and change that. If both files exist on the server, what will happen is whichever one is found in that list first gets displayed. How do I know this? I had that mistake happen to me early on in my career. And we had, in this particular case, index.htm and index.html. And I was updating index.html, which was the second file that it would look for. And so since it looked for it second, it found the existing index.html first, and none of my changes were showing up. And it took me a good 15 or 20 minutes to realize what had happened. It was frustrating, and that's why I let you know. If you have a change and you're not seeing updated, make sure you're uploading it to the server, and that if you are looking in a root folder, that file exists and nothing else above it in that default file list exists. In this class, we will be looking for index.html as the home page for your site and any folders you create as a subfolder. Now, the second thing that can happen is maybe none of the files in that default list are there. Well, your server now has an option. It can do one of two things, and it's completely based upon how it's configured. The server may decide to send to your browser, hey, here's a list of all the files in that folder. And I've done this on occasion. I don't want to have to create a page and create 50 or 100 or more links, so I say, here you go. Or it could say, folder contents listing denied, and it won't let you see the list of all the files in that folder. This is becoming more and more common as it's a little bit more secure from an internet security and cybersecurity perspective. So this keeps directories out of potential hackers' hands. They have to only be able they can only see the files that we want them to see by direct links instead of being able to see everything at one time. So those are the two most common pieces So those are two groups of software that are used together that you'll need to know about in order to display a web page. The web server software and the web browser software. While there's different types of both, if you have a well-defined web page, it doesn't matter. It should work regardless of what your server or your browser is.